My incident happened over a series of days, 2 days in California, usually about 5:30 a.m. in the morning. I was driving a large van on a 2-lane road through a canyon with a creek bed on my way to pick up special need passengers to take them to school. Suddenly, a mature deer came out of the woods and ran right alongside me, as if to get away from something scarier than people. As I took my foot off the gas, I slowed and then seemed to speed up, which I found odd. Further on, an apparently young man came to the edge of the road on my left, smiling where the creek was. I stopped on a dime to let him pass to the other side, a steep cliff going up. Instead of seeing him pass, all I could see was apparent fur across 2/3 of my windshield, and my driver door window went black. It was dark outside, and I could see the hair and fur because of my headlights. Then, in a swift motion, the fur went to a nearly straight-up cliff and disappeared, with an owl being knocked to the ground from its perch. The only way a human being could have ascended that steep incline would have been with a rope with a hook on the end and pulling himself up. But these apparent animals went up like the wind. What I later figured happened is the 6-foot person I stopped the car for must have been a young Bigfoot, and the 2 adult Bigfoots escorted it up the hill from my right for protection. The one in front of the van was so tall I couldn't even make out a shoulder. The one on the driver door was no doubt keeping me from stepping out. Bigfoot crossing guards, or I witnessed a human abduction. When I returned from the trip, I noticed an 18-inch muddy handprint on the back of the van, and it must have been made when I was accelerating, even though my foot was off the gas. I had apparently intruded upon their hunt, and he was pushing me down the road to get me out of the way. On a subsequent visit, I would roll my window down and whistle in the direction of the creek as I drove by. I did this for a week until one day I turned the corner to that spot, and there was a broken off tree in the middle of the road, which made the hair on my neck rise. Upon inspection, later in the daylight, I saw that it had been broken off 50 feet from the road, 8 feet up the tree, and carried, since there were no drag marks. It was a healthy tree, 10 inches in diameter. On Christmas Day, I went out to look for footprints. The moment I opened up my car door and stepped out, there was a huge wood bashing on one of the hundreds of oak trees opposite the creek that echoed all over the area. As I said, it would be extremely difficult for a man to go up that very steep incline in those oak trees. I went to the creek area, but felt I should not venture further due to the warning knocks from the sentinel Bigfoot, and had to be 1 or 2 or more of them right where I was. I got in my car and left. There were 3 huge bashing wood knocks, 3 at a time, that echoed everywhere while I was there. One morning, when I was picking up one of the kids located directly over the hill from that creek, there was a huge wood knock in the woods behind that house. They know me, what I look like, and are warning me. The interest of that Bigfoot and his particular house came to mind. There are stacked rocks all over this yard, very carefully balanced. The owner lady told me that she did it herself, but sounded very unbelievable. Why would someone make 50 piles of carefully balanced rocks in their front yard? It's my opinion that she has developed a relationship with a Bigfoot, or perhaps more than one. I asked a homeless person if he knew anything about Bigfoot in the area, and he told me that he was fully aware of a family of 3 living in the creek area. I saw 3. He told me that one of his friends tried sleeping under a bridge at the creek, and his mangled and torn up body was later found, having been dragged out from under the bridge. The sheriff said it was a bear or mountain lion, but the homeless guy said no. The body was too severely shredded for that to be true. A lady actor from the local playhouse said she was doing her usual Saturday night traveling through that creek area after a show when, without warning, the car slid into the next lane. She stopped and nothing was there. She later went to the gas station and looked for dents or scratches, and there weren't any. She makes no conjecture as to what happened and by who. One morning, after the tree in the road, I looked over to the creek area and saw two glowing red eyes, very wide apart, impossibly high off the ground. Could have been 10 feet tall. Deer commonly come darting out from the darkness towards my vehicle before sunrise. This is a natural and a sure sign of seeking protection. I have tried to get any Bigfoot searching teams across the nation to come and find Bigfoot's lair, and they have shown zero interest, and I've been snubbed. What is going on? Now, this isn't a story I share a lot. Coming from the back country of Idaho, I've met plenty of people who have claimed to see the famous Sasquatch of the Northern Hemisphere. These stories are often shared openly in bars of where I grew up, and are widely accepted as a quantity of people here have also seen them. But I saw something much different. Wolves have been reintroduced into the Idaho wilderness in 1995 and were a protected species up until the fall of 2011. So Idaho and the area around Stanley were particularly dense in wolves, and many people had problems with them picking off livestock and pets. It was in August of 2010 when me and some friends decided to take a long 50-mile backpacking trip through the Sawtooth Mountains and fly fish at a few lakes that were far from the trail most people would take. These often produced the best fishing, since they were rarely, if ever, visited. There were 5 of us, and we also brought 5 horses. 3 guys rode, and the other horses packed cooking gear and other essential equipment. Me and a friend, I will call Josh, decided we would walk 50 miles since we were both leaving for the military that fall. The first day, we hiked around 10 miles and stopped at Lake Taxaway for the night. The only other eventful thing that happened that night was a terrible high mountain thunderstorm that destroyed my tent and got me and all of my gear soaking wet. Needless to say, that next morning, I was in a pretty bad mood. Deciding I needed to be cheered up, Josh made a plan that the other guys and horses would continue on our previously planned route and set up a camp, while me and Josh went off the trail a few miles to try and fish a small lake we had both been previously and had good luck. We spent the day fishing this lake, and honestly, catching more brook trout than we ever had before. After eating a few of the trout we caught, we shared a few drinks out of a bottle of Jack Daniels that I decided would be worth the extra weight in my pack. We both decided to sleep under the stars that night, since it showed no signs of rain. I woke up at about 2 a.m. I remember sitting in my mummy bag, trying to figure out what woke me up. A few seconds later, I recognized the howling of a wolf pack somewhere in the mountains. I figured it had woke Josh, who I heard unzipping his sleeping bag to grab his Glock, the same thing that I was doing. Mine had been in my mummy bag the whole night, and was currently sitting on my chest. The sounds of wolves were not new to us. Both of us were experienced hunters and backpackers, and we had seen our fair share of the furry animals. The area we were in was a saddle between 2 peaks, and acted as a funnel for wildlife, including wolves. They would move from further up the mountains to the area we were in on their way to Grangine, where there was more flat grassland, which meant more prey. After a minute or 2 of the howling, I was starting to fall back asleep. Then it went quiet. But not just the wolves, the crickets, small rustlings in the bushes. It even felt like the air was shushed. That's when we heard the sound that we will live on in my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was deeper, throatier than the wolves. It sounded like a human was trying to imitate the wolves, and it was trying to call, like over a loudspeaker. The sound of it made me feel cold to my bones. It made me want to curl up in a ball. It ended, and the world stayed silent for a little longer before returning to the life-filled night that was natural. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we both started hiking again, joking about how scared we were in the previous night, both just chalking it up to maybe a larger wolf. But we decided to take a different route to base camp that our friends had set up as a shortcut. This path would take us through some back country that neither of us had ever been through, and by the looks of it, not many others either. The brush got thicker here, and the ground had leveled out. As we walked and talked, we both fell into a sort of nervous and cautious silence. There was something wrong. We both felt it, and it made us nervous. There was this smell. It was strong and musky, like the smell in a dog pound, but it was everywhere. At one point, we thought we could hear something moving in the brush off to our right. We finally started up the mountainside and got out of the trees and out into the open on a flat ridge. We got out snacks and started eating. Looking ahead of us, we could see the smoke from what we assumed was our friend's campfire, maybe 2 miles away. We started to talk and joke about bad juju that we had felt in that small valley. But suddenly, Josh got very quiet and pale. I looked behind me and followed his gaze to the opposing side of the small valley, maybe 400 yards away. It took me a second to see, but there was something dark and moving on the hill. For a second, I thought it was another hiker, but it was bigger, with the bulk in the wrong places. I'm not a big guy, just a little over 5'7", and around 165 pounds. This thing had to be around 7 feet tall, judging by the trees it was near. The thing that threw me off were its legs. They didn't seem short and stocky like that of a bear. They were long and thick, more like an Olympic sprinter. We were too far to see its face clearly, but it clearly had cropped ears and a short snout. It just stood there, still. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, and it was just a bear standing in the upright position, a very weird position. Then it dropped on all fours and took off down into the trees. The way it ran gave me chills. Its arms looked longer than its legs, vaulting it down the hill at an angle away from us. Its back didn't stay flat like a bear's. Instead, it arced, like a man in a costume bending over to a bear crawl. It was out of sight before we realized it was moving. Me and Josh quietly stood up, more or less, and jogged the 2 miles downhill to our friend's camp. When we got there, we were both sweating and out of breath. When questioned, we made some excuse about trying to race to camp from the hill. One of the guys was fairly new to the outdoors, and we didn't want to freak the kid out. We spent the day at the small lake they were camped at and fished for our dinner. That night, we all shared some drinks and Dutch oven cobbler before turning the lanterns off for the night. Me and Josh decided to share a tent. Neither of us wanted to admit that we were both a little freaked out by what we had seen earlier. I woke up again around midnight. I could hear Josh slowly breathing and someone else snoring in another tent. While in a tent, it's hard to hear exactly pinpoint where noises are coming from, but I could distinguish where the horses were. They were gnawing and pawing at the ground, which usually means they are distressed or anxious. This put me off a little. Then I heard it again. That same guttural howl from the previous night, but this time, it was much closer. It howled about every minute and continued to grow louder every time. I could tell Josh was awake, and like me, he was paralyzed with fear. The horses had gone quiet, and the next morning, we learned that they had broken their high line and had taken off. We heard slow, hesitant footsteps to the other side of the camp. Along with the sound of it walking was the sound of low growls and sniffling. Then, it slowly started moving. The breathing was like that of a giant dog, and panting. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I was afraid it would hear me. I heard it walk past our tent. It stopped. I had visions of it ripping open the tent and tearing us apart. Then I heard the audible click of a safety being taken off a handgun in another tent. The thing turned and ran. After this, none of us slept. The next morning, we quickly broke down camp and found the horses in the nearby meadow that they stopped in. After this, we packed up and left our trip early. None of us wanted to try our luck with a second night. I have tried talking to hunters around Stanley and Grangian about it. They are hesitant, but say whatever it is, it kills cattle from time to time, and they think there are multiples of them. Local police departments have either a file for it, since it has taken so many cattle. People even believe it is responsible for the occasional hiker or hunter who disappears. Supposedly, leaves prints that are an elongated foot human with longer clawed toes. I have searched the web for it and other things like it. The images of dogmen are the closest thing that resembles what I saw. Easy to say, I don't have too many nights alone in that area of the Sawtooths anymore. I work as a road construction laborer. One day, earlier in 2019, I was in southwestern Kansas, just a few miles from the Colorado and Oklahoma borders. We were closing a main highway for stripe removal to allow the county to restripe it. The day was going slow, and the water grinder truck was overheating and having a few problems, and I found it my turn to be the flagman, since I was a new hire to this company. The fields around me seemed to be empty farmland and pastures of emerald and amber grass where there were hills and large segments of trees that I couldn't see how far back they went, but I could tell they were thick. There was a hole in the electric barbed wire fence next to me. Well, a few hours into the day, I feel an odd sensation and look in the direction that it feels like it's coming from, and see a large black dog running through the field near the trees, maybe 100 yards away from me, and I don't think anything about it. Later, the owner of the property comes out to fix his fence, and I ask him about his dog since I couldn't tell what kind of dog it was, and he looks at me like I'm speaking Greek and tells me I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have any dogs on the farm. I then told him about what I'd seen, and he looked at the hole in the fence, and then the trees, and drove back up to his house. That's how the story ends. I had never heard from him again, never seen the dog or felt the feeling ever again. Hello, my name is Christian Morris, and boy do I have a story to tell you. It all happened in the span of a week. I was messing around with some friends after school by the Salt River. We were talking when we noticed something out of the corner of our eyes. It looked like some kind of human, but with a full set of fur on its body. You bet your sweet butt that me and my friends got out of there as quick as we could. I thought that would be the last we saw of it, but no. We saw it again a few days later. This time we were walking up the road near the first place we found it. My friend had to take a piss, so we went into the woods. A couple of minutes later, I heard him scream. I got the hell out of there as quickly as possible. It turns out he went to pee behind a log and found some footprints. Shortly after this, he heard what sounded like thrown rocks. That's when he screamed. This all happened about 2 years ago, and we haven't seen it since. I remember 6 years ago when I was 19. Me and a few friends went backpacking in the Appalachian Range of Pennsylvania. We had set up camp in the early afternoon. We knew it was a dangerous area, so we each brought guns for protection against bears. Anyway, as it got closer to the evening time, at around 5 p.m., I was fishing in a river about a quarter mile away from camp, and I started to smell something bad. I couldn't describe the smell. It was just bad. I heard some rustling in the bushes about 200 yards away. It was quite clear that it was footsteps from the sound. Almost thinking that it was one of my friends, I realized that they were south of me, so I began to panic. Whatever it was is getting closer to my fishing spot, and the smell began getting stronger. My fishing pole in my left hand and my right hand on my gun as I was getting ready to unholster it. I couldn't get over the smell, but at the same time, I was worried about my life. I kept my eyes looking in the direction of the loud footsteps. I can see a big open area, kinda like a pasture, about 65 yards away, which is where the footsteps are coming from. I see what I think is a man in a possible reddish-brown ghillie suit walking behind the trees on the edge of an open area. But the problem is that it was about 2 or 3 feet taller than me, as I'm only 6'2", which was unbelievable. None of my friends are close to my height, but that thing that I saw was built. I could see the muscle movement in its legs. Listen, I'm no expert about Sasquatch, but I do know what I saw was no bear, as it was walking on 2 legs, and not in a way that I've ever seen. Both the legs and arms are primitive-like, like an oversized gorilla. The thing probably weighed 900 pounds. It ended up vanishing as it went to my right in the deeper area of woods. But after the footsteps stopped, I heard what sounded like chatter, kind of like some sort of Indian language. After the chatter stopped, the footsteps started up again, but it was footsteps going in one direction and another sound of footsteps going in the opposite direction. I never told my friends about the experience because I didn't want them to think that I was crazy. Some people might be skeptic about this, but I know what I saw and heard, that it wasn't in the ordinary. I grew up in a hollow in a pretty small town in rural West Virginia. The hollow is roughly 3 miles long, but surrounded by family-owned forest land, at least 10 acres or more deep in every direction. The only homes located on the hollow were all family. We lived in the very last house on the road. We were the dead end of the road, and our closest neighbor was an uncle about 200 yards down a field. My brother and I grew up very poor, so we spent most of our free time outside, roaming the woods and whatnot. I remember so many times wandering around in the woods, and when it would just fall silent around us, birds suddenly stopped chirping. Little animals stopped rustling in the leaves. Just complete silence. We always took that as our own personal signal to head home, like the woods were saying, "That's enough for today." As kids, we never thought much of it. But now recounting this story, it definitely makes sense. My brother and I grew up apart as we went to middle school, so we did not spend a lot of time together in the woods anymore, and mostly stayed in our moms, like preteens usually do. One evening, though, our parents decided to go out for a bit of leaving, my brother and I with nothing to do. We decided to take a little hike for old time's sake. I was around 12, and my brother about 14. So this was roughly June 2004 or 2005. He had picked up cigarettes as a habit, so I credited his idea to head into the woods as an excuse to smoke freely and not have to worry about our parents popping in and catching him or smelling the smoke. We headed out and hiked a pretty decent distance from home. Definitely far enough to keep his nicotine habit a secret from our parents, and way, way out of sight. We decided to stop and sit for a bit. It was mid-evening now, and the sun was dimmer, but left us just enough time to hang out for a while and make it back home, with time to spare before it was dark out. He set into smoking his cigarettes, and I had picked up a stick and was just whacking plants and digging in the dirt. We were sort of having short bursts of conversation, but mostly sat there, lost in our own thoughts. After about 30 minutes of sitting there, that strange silence fell over us again, and we looked at each other to gauge if the other thought that we should head back like we used to as kids when it got quiet out there. My brother just shrugged it off and lit another cigarette, so I went back to digging in the dirt, lost in my own business. I was feeling a little uneasy, but figured I was just being chicken because my brother seemed completely unbothered. I was so silent that I could hear my brother calmly breathing across from me and could even hear the tobacco crackle when he took a draw off a cigarette. I heard a little rustling that sounded a little off in the distance and some twigs breaking. We literally grew up in the woods and were taught about all kinds of wildlife by our hunter of a father. I credited the rustling to a deer or coyote off a ways from us and never even looked up. A few minutes later, though, something caused me to look up. The calm breathing I had heard from my brother seemed to be caught in his throat. I jerked my head up to see what was wrong with him. His face was pure white, and he was looking a little to my right and packed behind me. Normally, I would have laughed it off because my brother loved trying to scare me and playing little pranks, but the look on his face was pure horror. I turned my whole body in the direction he was looking. About 50 or so yards away was a creature. This thing was standing on 2 legs and stood every bit of 7 feet tall. Even at the distance, it looked huge. I backed toward my brother without taking my eyes off of this thing. It looked like it was covered in fur, dark brown or black. I'm not sure about the eyes since we were just far away enough not to make out the smaller details, but if the sun had hit them, I can guess they would have been a yellow or gold. We kept gaze with it for what seemed like hours, even though it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. It didn't move the whole time we stared at it to this point, like it was sizing us up just as we were it. After what seemed like an eternity, probably about 3 or 4 minutes by now, it kind of huffed at us. It wasn't a growl or snarl. It just seemed to be testing us to see how we would react if it threatened us in some way. We stood concrete still. It then dropped on all fours and took on a single awkward step toward us, like it wasn't used to moving on all four, but wanted to seem animalistic. Again, we did not move. After being told all your life not to run from predators or they will chase you, we weren't risking a race with this thing. It took one more clumsy step toward us. When we did not budge, it took off in the opposite direction. As soon as it was completely out of sight, we darted home. I don't think we had ever cleared the woods so quickly in our lives. We burst through the front door and locked it behind us. We had just collapsed in the living room and never even spoke. Our parents made it home shortly after and were concerned that they had to have us unlock the door to let them in. We never told them what happened, and we never spoke about it, even to each other. Not even to this day, and I am almost 28 years old. My brother passed away in 2015, and I wish a million times over we had discussed what we saw that day. I plan to tell my father and uncle about it this next week or so. I'm hoping with all the hunting they have done that they have seen something too. I'll write back if they have any stories to add.